This is Track Talk, and we're back with a recording of 1830. This is a game that Stephen Yu played. I've monitored his games because he's a high-level player, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in this game, a lot to learn from, so I'm very excited to have the opportunity to bring it to the channel. We'll jump in. Stephen Yu is going to lead us off with a bid on the D&H. Lee Gamer, a gamer or a player that is new to the channel, I believe. Bids on the CNA. We've talked about it before, but playing online, bidding on the CNA as your first bid is oftentimes a good, strong move because you have no guarantee of the skill of the other players. Sometimes you can walk away with it for basically face value. Ben is going to bring us out on the M&H. So the three kind of high value privates all have one bid on them, and Blue Blood rounds us off with a second bid on the Camden and Amboy. So at this point, I think Stephen Yu and Benthic are probably hoping to get an early pull so they can get their privates for very cheap and allow Blue Blood and Lee Gamer to fight it out for the Camden and Amboy. And Stephen is going to compete with Ben a little bit on the Mohawk and Hudson. I do not love being on both the D&H and the M&H. I think that winning both of these privates is very dangerous. It leaves you with very little cash to operate with, and buying in both of these privates for full value can sometimes be challenging, especially if you're needing to buy a permanent train, which you always do afterwards. So I think that if I was Steven, I probably would have been tempted to bid on the Champlain and St. Lawrence and just hope that someone messes up and pulls the Schuylkill, or that you can get one of those privates at face instead of bidding on the M&H. Lee Gamer only has a bid on the Camden and Amboy, so he is, on the other hand, I think not motivated for an early pull, and he will ignore my thoughts and actually bid on the Champlain and St. Lawrence. So if Ben wants to, he could pull here, but that would be giving Lee and Steven face value privates, so probably not going to be looking to do that. And I think that he will probably be forced to compete for the D&H. Champlain and St. Lawrence is not a great private, and probably he would rather have the D&H, and he does exactly that. So now we have two players splitting two privates, and Blue Blood only has a bid on the Camden and Amboy. So if he pulled here, Lee Gamer potentially could price and force pretty well in the CNA. Um, and those two players would probably be, competing to win the CNA to avoid getting the B&O. So he may want to avoid that by bidding on another private, but we'll see. Instead, he pulls. Um, so this does leave him in a situation where he's going to be competing with Lee Gamer for basically lowest private income, and one of them is going to have to win the CNA to avoid the B&O, which may lead to a pretty expensive CNA. As we mentioned, Ben and Steven are both on the D&H and the M&H. This is a situation I find myself in not uncommonly in the 1830 auction, and it is a little bit of an unfortunate situation, I think, because you have to worry about winning both of these privates, which can really slow your early game down. So my strategy for this situation is usually to bid the D&H up, where it's not going for just a song, bid it up a little bit, but then intentionally lose that, hoping that the other player will then have inadequate capital to really price and force the M&H, and I might be able to get a cheaper, bid on the M&H than I otherwise would. If the other player does bid high on the M&H, you can dump it on him and just force him to run two pretty expensive privates and then consign yourself to the B&O, which is not really the end of the world. I don't like the B&O, but I do think it's still a winnable position. So Steven's going to start us off with the D&H and bids for 85. Ben is keeping right up along, and it looks like Ben bids 110, and then Steven passes. So Steven is basically taking the strategy that I was discussing, where you bid up the D&H as high as you're comfortable, and then dump it on the other player and hope for a cheaper M&H as a result. Because I think Ben has to be a little bit scared here about winning the M&H in addition to the D&H. We'll see how expensive this private goes. So up to 160, 165, and then Ben passes. So both of those privates went for, near the north end of what they, really are worth. So I think both players are, happy to have price enforced, but both are wishing they had got their private for a little bit cheaper than they did. And really, both of these players are hoping that the CNA is bid up pretty well because they've both paid, near the top end for their privates. And if the CNA goes cheap, then their privates are a little less valuable in relative terms. In terms of priority and who gets the CNA, it kind of doesn't matter. Neither of these players are going to be going first because whoever loses this auction is going to have to buy the B&O. So if Lee loses Blue Blood, if Lee loses, he buys the B&O, and then Benthic will go first. So it's not like Blue Blood is obviously going to get first dibs at the PRR, but still it makes sense to bid the CNA up. It's still a good private. So they will bid it all the way up. And it eventually goes for 225, which is a pretty cheap CNA. I mean, it's not unreasonably cheap, but it is on the cheaper side, and Blue Blood won it, and he has more than $335, so he will be able to par the PRR if given an opportunity in OR1. And Lee Gamer is left to buy the B&O, which means Ben will have priority. So unless Ben takes the PRR, we will see Blue Blood having the CNA and a company in the first operating round, which is a very dangerous position for the table. So I imagine Lee takes the B&O here. He does, and he pars it at 100, which is very standard. So Ben is in a rough spot here, in some sense. He has to decide whether or not he wants to deny the Blue Blood player a float in the first operating round by taking the PRR, or if he just wants to take, a company of his choice. The downside to giving Blue Blood the PRR is that he could potentially buy in his private very early and then, just run away with the game. However, what we'll say is that if Ben does give Blue Blood a PRR, he's going to have to par it at 67, and that means that he will potentially be operating second in operating order because probably Steven is not going to intentionally operate before the PRR player. So there's no guarantee that the PRR player will be able to buy in stock round one if the other players play properly. And also, if Benthic does try to deny Blue Blood the PRR, he then has the opportunity of selling that $67 share in stock round two and then being able to float, in stock round two, which is not really that much of a difference. So ultimately, it looks like Benthic decides to par the CNO and just give the PRR away. The CNO, of course, has a hotter early game potential than the PRR. And Benthic also has the D&H, which is a very nice combination for the CNO, because if there's ever competition for Lancaster, for instance, there's an early float to the B&O and the PRR, and they cooperate in both token and Lancaster, the CNO still is not locked out of New York and Philadelphia because it can potentially teleport to Scranton. So that's a nice escape valve for the CNO player. So regardless, CNO gets floated, not the PRR, and Blue Blood will float the PRR. This is, if you read strategy guides, a bad situation for the table, but I think based on the discussion we've just had, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Stephen Yu, on the other hand, has plenty of cash to float unassisted and will be looking to take one of the typical starting companies. Probably, yeah, he takes the NYNH. Lee Gamer, not enough money to float the B&O on his own, so can just sit on his cash or can look to buy paying shares. And he will buy an NYNH. This does help the other players. It's less capital of their own that they have to invest. And the company that's going to be running the hottest is the CNO. So if the other players can avoid buying a share in their own company and buying a CNO share instead, I'm sure they would be happy to take advantage of that. Ben is buying his CNO, and the other players are continuing to float their own companies. Lee now buys a PRR, so he may just buy one share in each of these companies, hope to get some stock appreciation, one round of revenue, and then sell out of them and float his B&O. The NYNH has floated. Oh, sorry. The PRR has floated, and Lee has spread his money around as we discussed. CNO is now floated. It looks like the NY and H will be last to float. So in theory, Lee Gamer could end up with priority if the other players just sit on their cash. Ben is going to buy an NY and H share. I think that's probably not the best play. First of all, you're sacrificing, going earlier in priority by spending your money. And also, if you're going to buy a share, buy the CNO because it pays better. Stephen Yu, also not worried too much about priority, will buy that better paying CNO share. And this is a consequence of him not needing to spend that money to float the NYNH. So there is a downside to what Lee has done in spreading his cash around. Benthic, it looks like he does buy the 6 share in the CNO. So did see, quote unquote, the error in his ways and max invest in the CNO, which should be the best paying company. This leaves Blue Blood with priority. That is the CNA player. So if, for instance, the CNO for some reason were to buy a ton of 2s here, the PRR player would basically be winning the game because he could just buy into the greens, buy in his privates, sell down the PRR, and start a new company and just run away with things. But I don't imagine that the CNO player will do that as he can only really run 1-2 train. Heading towards Chicago, buys a single train. PRR probably heading towards Lancaster does and buys a single train. And now the NY&H has the decision on New Haven, which company he wants to help or cooperate with between the B&M and the NYC. So he lays track that is more helpful for the B&M, also helps the NY&H run pretty well in the early game, but he will have to buy a ton of 2 trains, 3 specifically, to take full advantage of that. So I don't think he's going to be motivated to do that. And he just buys 1. Blue Blood, not enough money for shares, may just be passing. Only person with anything to do other than sell is Lee Gamer, so instead he will sell down the PRR. So this is an interesting play. We're starting to get into the part that I wanted to talk about. He has left his presidency unprotected here. He cannot buy any more shares in the PRR, and there are plenty of shares in the market and in the IPO that would allow Lee Gamer specifically to take this over. So Lee would need 4 shares. They're all about $60. He already has 170 just cash lying around. If he were to sell shares in these other companies, he could easily take this presidency, which would allow him to buy in his private. It's not the best private, but it is cash, and he would be able to maintain his private income from the Baltimore and Ohio for no penalty, basically. So I think that this is a very greedy move. You're basically selling a PRR to buy a paying share in some other company. The difference in revenue is going to be, less than $10, and you potentially give up control of the PRR, which was the whole point of winning the CNA to begin with. So that is a very risky play, I think, from Blue Blood. He will buy an NY&H. So again, the CNO is running for more than the NY&H. If you're going to risk your presidency for a share, why would you risk it for the worst company? Regardless, we'll move on. CNU probably passing. Lee Gamer, does he press for the PRR here? He's just going to sit on his cash. So again, I think that's a little bit of a missed opportunity. You could take over the PRR here, and I don't think that the Blue Blood player has the capital to float the B&O. That would be the risk, I guess. So maybe Blue Blood's trying to tempt Lee Gamer to do that. I haven't done the math here, but I think that Lee Gamer would still be able to defend if Blue Blood were to sell out and try and dump the PRR on him. And we just passed into the stock round. So I think bad play from Blue Blood and Lee Gamer there, but we will be getting to a more interesting part of the game in just a minute. CNO laying into Chicago, probably running for 70 and just pays out. NY&H didn't buy the 3 trains, so probably not motivated to lay track on Providence, and will just probably run his train and pass. And PRR linking up with Lancaster does leave a token there, so setting himself up for a little bit of a better run next OR, and he pays out. So going into this stock round, Stephen Yu has priority. He has second most cash in the game. Lee Gamer just sat on a bunch of cash last time, so that's why he has the most. Also has the most private income. But he now has the cash to float his B&O. So I think the other players probably need to be cognizant of this. This player has demonstrated that he's not eager to invest in paying shares in other companies, at least not beyond 10%. So if I'm Stephen Yu here, it would be more efficient to maybe just pass here, see what Lee Gamer does. I imagine he's going to sell out of the PRR, NYNH, and CNO. And then when it comes back around to Stephen Yu, he can buy a cheap market share as opposed to buying a company that is about to be tanked. Granted, all these companies are at 67, so selling one time is not going to change the worth of these companies all that much. But I think that's the kind of thing you have to think about if you want to be a very efficient, successful player. Stephen Yu, he buys a share in the NYNH. Again, if the NYNH is sold, it's not going to change the value, so he's not actually losing, much by doing this. But in other situations, he could be. Lee Gamer now sells out of these companies, so one share in each, and he's going to work on floating the B&O. Interestingly, and this will become relevant later in this stock round, Lee Gamer has sold out of all three of the other companies. So this is functionally a three-player game with respect to the NYNH, CNO, and PRR, because Lee Gamer is just going to be stuck in the B&O for the duration of this stock round. Benthic now has money for a share and probably looks towards the NYNH. The IPO share is safe to buy, even if he has two shares in the company, it's not going to be dumpable. And you have to think now about, the order that these companies are operating in, because the B&O is going to be basically break the deadlock on these two trains. So when there's three two trains in the market and you already have a two train, you're not going to be able to buy into the threes and open up the privates. So we've stressed the C&A player's position in this game a lot already. The C&A player is running the PRR. The PRR is last in priority. So as long as the B&O buys a single two train, he's going to be able to buy the other two trains, the first three, and then his privates, which will allow him to float another company and really get his snowball rolling. So the other players are cognizant of this and need to be careful that the PRR doesn't have too easy of a job buying in his private. So they're assuming that B&O is just going to buy one two train. And if they force the PRR to buy the other two trains and then also the three, it's going to have a lot less capital buying its privates, be a much less healthy company for Blue Blood. So they may look to, or they do look to manipulate turn order here so that they can operate after the PRR. Hopefully the PRR will then be forced to buy in its trains, buy its trains for them and then buy in its privates. So Benthic, he is going to buy a PRR share, maybe not yet recognizing the situation that will soon develop, but may have been more wise to either sit on his cash or buy a different company because the PRR is a company that is looking to operate last. So you have to assume that it's going to be, selling down. Blue Blood, he buys a B&O and just tanks it once. Kind of just a wasted stock action, doesn't really change anything. And Stephen Yu now, I think, is recognizing the danger in that the PRR is looking to operate last and has some very lucrative privates to buy in. So I believe he now is going to manipulate turn order. So he sells one of his NYNH shares, still has a secure presidency, and as a result of this is operating after the PRR. So he's doing the calculus that the PRR player is highly incentivized to buy in its privates, may be willing to buy a bunch of cheap non-permanent trains to get into green, and then Stephen Yu can just buy a single three or maybe not even buy a train and buy in his private without having to buy those worthless trains. So that's why he did that. He will, transition his cash over to the PRR, probably assuming that the PRR president is not going to be super eager to sell another share in the PRR because then he will just have 3-share presidency, which leaves it very vulnerable. Let's not forget that this company still has $500 in cash, so losing the presidency is not great. And as a result, it feels like it's a safe investment. Lee Gamer are going to continue to float the B&O. Benthic now, I think, has kind of cottoned on to what is going on with this turn order manipulation. He has 6 shares in his presidency, so he's free to do the exact same thing that the NYNH has done, and sell a single share to operate after the PRR, which is what he does. And now the operating order is very unfavorable for the PRR player. The PRR player, well, let's just see here. Benthic has cash that he could invest, and he buys a second share of the NYNH. This is still not a dumpable company as long as the status quo is maintained. But if the blue blood player, you know, buys another share out of the market, it will become dumpable. So he needs to be a little bit careful there. He is probably assuming that Lee Gamer is going to give him priority. All things being even, Lee Gamers has the most cash. He's floating a company. Pretty safe assumption. So not a bad investment in the NYNH. Blue Blood, PRR, and CNA player now notices that he is last or first in operating order between these three companies, and he actually does something which is interesting. He buys a share of the PRR and then sells it. So he hasn't left himself with a 3-share presidency, but he has left himself with a 4-share presidency in a company that has been sold down heavily. So these shares are quite cheap. And he has basically ensured that he will be able to operate after these other companies by doing this, but has left himself quite vulnerable. The other players now have the decision to make, are they going to accept this? Are they going to try and steal the PRR? Are they going to sell their own companies? So this is where it becomes very interesting. So I think that the move by Blue Blood here is really what sets up the rest of the stock round for the way it goes. Stephen, still noticing that the PRR is going to be operating last, will actually sell down a share of his own NYNH. So he also has left himself vulnerable to a takeover. Benthic has 2 shares already, and there's 3 shares in the market, so he could lose control of this company. But he has basically assured that he will be operating after the PRR. I keep saying assured, but obviously, as we've seen, none of this is assured by any means, because some crazy stuff is going on. So he sells an NYNH, can buy a paying share in another company, and actually is just going to hold on to his cash. Lee Gamer does float the B&O now, can buy that cheap market share if he wants, but again, because he is sold out of these companies, is kind of irrelevant for the interesting part of the stock round. Benthic, seeing that the turn order continues to be manipulated, is going to follow suit. And now we have 3 insecure presidencies in this stock round. Currently, Benthic is operating last and PRR is operating first. So this is kind of the way things have been. And this is what desperately Blue Blood is trying to avoid and is triggering all this shenanigans. Benthic can also just sit on cash here, where he could buy paying share in these other companies, but needs to be a little bit careful that they don't continue to get sold down and he just erodes his net worth. These players are trailing Lee Gamer in terms of value as a result of just piecemeal sailing down and having their shares erode in value. So Blue Blood needs to do something to change the status quo. He is operating first and has demonstrated that he is very motivated to not be in that position. He can basically try to sell down the PRR further and then try and take over someone else's company. But the downside of doing that is that every share he sells in the PRR pushes it further later in operating order, and then he's going to end up taking over a company that is operating before it, which is the exact situation he doesn't want to have happen. So he needs to be careful. What he could try to do here is just shelve or ledge the PRR, sell 2 shares in it. He has the ability to do that. That will guarantee, fix the PRR's operating order. And then he could go to take over one of these other companies. So he is not able to take over the NYNH, or he can't guarantee that he can take it over because there's only 3 shares in the market and he only has 1 share. So if he were to sell out of the PRR, someone will take that company over, and then he would potentially be at risk of having no company, which is even worse than operating first in operating order. So he's going to be forced, if he wants to sell the PRR, to try and take over the CNO. CNO is a company that can be taken over. It's just more expensive because he has to buy more shares and he has to buy that more expensive IPO share. So Benthic probably is recognizing that he has a vulnerable presidency here and doing this math, needs to be aware of that possibility. Benthik also has the opportunity to sell out of the CNO, ledge it, and then try and take over a company. He, on the other hand, would probably be looking towards the NYNH. He can guarantee that well, he can't guarantee it, but he has a better chance of taking that over than he does the PRR, which Stephen Yu is operating ahead of him, so could be buy enough shares to prevent him from taking it over. So basically, all these players have vulnerable presidencies. They all have manipulated turn order, and they all want to make sure, absolutely sure, that they don't leave this stock round without a company. So a lot of mental calculus being done, I'm sure, to try and figure out the best path forward, and it gets very complicated. The other thing that we have to be aware of, in addition to operating order, is the relative worth of these companies. So the CNO is a great company. It runs for the most, but we're going to be quickly exiting the yellow phase. So once greens open up, that changes a little bit. And then the other thing to notice is that the CNO is a great company for the player that owns the D&H, but it's a less good company. Not that it's bad, it's just less good for the other players because they don't have that teleportability. So Benthik is happy to run the CNO, but the other players are probably a little bit less happy to run it. And then the other thing that we should note is that because the NYNH has laid towards the BNM, it has really kind of neutered long-term runs for that company, and that makes that company a lot less appealing. So if you're thinking from these different players' perspectives, we discussed how Benthik is probably going to be taking the NYNH instead of the PRR if that situation comes to pass. He's much less motivated to take the NYNH because it's just not as good of a company as the CNO is, particularly for him. Whereas Blue Blood, if he were to take the CNO, the PRR is still a good company. It has a little bit less cash, but he doesn't have that teleport ability that the CNO player does. So he needs to worry that if he takes the CNO, he might be blocked out of Lancaster by the PRR, the new president of the PRR, and the BNO player. So it gets very complicated. I spent a long time thinking about this situation, and it's very interesting. Benthik will just pass, and Blue Blood is going to pressure the NYNH. So he buys a share there. He cannot guarantee that he takes the presidency here because there's only 2 shares in the market. So, as long as Benthik doesn't sell out of the NYNH, the company is safe for Stephen Yu. This does mean that Stephen Yu is feeling pretty secure in pressuring the PRR, and he could sell out of the CNO to do that. So we'll see how that develops. Stephen Yu is going to pass. And currently, everybody but Blue Blood is happy with operating order. So that's why I think we see Stephen Yu just passing. He doesn't feel like it's necessary to really pressure for a second presidency. Lee Gamer, he buys his final share, leaving a share in the market. And Benthik, probably also happy with this situation. I believe he's operating last, yes. So everybody but Blue Blood is happy with this. I mean, I don't think anybody's happy, to be frank, because everyone's, tanked their companies. But Blue Blood is the one that is going to be motivated to upset the status quo here. And we'll see how he goes about that. So he sells down a PRR. He weakens his presidency even further to try and make sure he's operating last, but he doesn't do it in a way that's, very secure because the PRR's operating order is still not fixed. So there can be some shenanigans to, manipulate things even further later in the stock round. He has some cash here, and because he has made his presidency so vulnerable, he needs to think about, how is he going to ensure that he leaves the stock round with a presidency? So he actually buys a CNO. This puts Benthik under a lot of pressure because, the CNO is insecure. It can be taken over. And Blue Blood is kind of posturing that if things don't go his way, or if Benthik were to sell another share to manipulate turn order, for instance, then he could swap companies. Stephen Yu sees this. He's been very motivated to prevent Blue Blood from taking last in priority. So he could just steal the PRR now, right? So if Stephen wants to prevent Blue Blood from having an easy buy-in, the easiest way to go about that is just to take the PRR away, because the PRR is operating last and he has $100. That's 2 shares already. He would just have to sell 1 share in order to take the presidency. He probably would be motivated to sell the CNO rather than the NYNH, because I'm sure that he would prefer to have 2 presidencies in healthy companies rather than just one. So I imagine that he's going to buy a PRR here, and doesn't have to sell the CNO share yet, but may look to do that in the very near future. And it looks like he will pressure. So Benthic sees this. He doesn't really need to get involved in this per se. He can just sit on his cash, watch the other players duke it out, and see what comes about. So, but he is noticing that Blue Blood is going to lose this presidency. So he's probably a little bit nervous that his own CNO presidency is under fire here. So I forgot about this. Benthic buys a PRR, and I remember now. The reason he does this is because he doesn't want Stephen Yu to have a real easy time taking over this presidency. He wants to hurt Stephen Yu. So by buying the cheap market share, Stephen Yu is not going to be able to just pay $50. He's going to have to pay $17 more, and he's going to have to sell 2 shares in order to have the cash to do that, rather than just selling 1 share to buy the cheaper $50 share. So a little bit risky from Benthic, as he's putting his cash in a company that may be losing value, and he's going to need all the value to ensure that another company can be taken over and he doesn't leave without a presidency. Blue Blood probably resigned to losing the PRR at this point, and he's going to have to take the presidency over of another company. But again, if he sells down the PRR, he's going to be operating a company that is operating before the PRR, which is the whole point of doing all this, is that he can operate last. So he probably doesn't want to sell a share in the PRR. He's more motivated to sell a share in the NYNH or the CNO. Again, he can't take over the NYNH, or he can't guarantee that he can, so he may sell a share in the NYNH to buy a CNO share and try and swap presidencies. He passes. Stephen Yu is going to force the issue. He buys that last market share. And as we noted before, in order to take the presidency here, you have to sell 2 shares rather than just one, because that market share is no longer available. So some kind of slick play from Benthic there. Benthic probably passing. He's okay with the status quo. He's not in danger of losing his presidency, and he's going to let the other players kind of determine, the path forward. Blue Blood, he cannot defend his presidency and wants to basically force Stephen Yu to show his hand by selling which 2 shares he decides, and then Blue Blood can respond. So Stephen Yu is going to have to sell 2 shares here, and he sells the CNO, which makes it very easy for Blue Blood to take it over with cheap $50 shares. That also puts the CNO operating behind the PRR, and he will take the presidency with a second sale. So he sells his NYNH. So now PRR is operating first, but he's going to be taking that presidency. So it's a little bit interesting that he sold in the order he did, because the NYNH, I see. So the NYNH is going to be taken over by Benthic, not by Blue Blood. So he's actually forcing the CNO to operate second in turn order, at least for now, by selling in the order he did. I imagine that was very calculated. And now we will see him take the IPO share to take the presidency of the PRR. He is operating first in operating order. I don't think he cares that much about that. He just doesn't want Blue Blood to operate first, or operate last. But he does have the option of manipulating turn order yet again by selling a share in the PRR. Blue Blood is unable to take the presidency back. Benthic could potentially, so maybe not eager to do that. Benthic now, recognizing that his CNO is going to be under fire, because one thing that Blue Blood absolutely cannot afford to have happen is to leave without a presidency to buy in his privates. So he needs to make sure that he can Benthic needs to make sure that he can take over the NYNH basically. He's not going to be able to take over the PRR, and he can't maintain the CNO. So he needs to prepare and make sure that he can take the NYNH. He also is still motivated to ensure that the CNO probably operates, early in turn order because he is assuming that blue blood is going to take it over. And the whole point of all this is to manipulate turn order. So he sells down the PRR. He has ledged that company, so that company can no longer be manipulated. And Stephen Yu is operating it. And he is now in a position to take over the NYNH. And he can also sell down the CNO whenever he wants to basically make sure that it doesn't operate, before or after the NYNH. So he is attacking that presidency, and he does sell down the CNO. And the reason he's doing this is because he is now guaranteed that when Blue Blood takes this over, he will be operating ahead of the NYNH. Blue Blood being the player that is very motivated to buy in trains to get his privates. So we will see all three of these presidencies swap, which is really crazy. And the way this came about was just really, really interesting to watch. Blue Blood is attacking the presidency. Will have an easier time of it because Benthic has sold it down. Stephen Yu, he just buys a cheap orange share of the PRR. Benthic going to be taking over the NYNH. And Blue Blood sells 2 shares in the NYNH, which basically guarantees that it will be operating after the CNO. So probably Benthic is thanking him for that because, again, everybody is trying to go last. He will buy a CNO share, and Benthic buys an NYNH. So I think that this is a big error from Benthic. I think the reason that he did this is because he didn't notice that the Blue Blood player had already done his job for him and ledged the NYNH. Otherwise, it makes no sense to buy and sell that share. Buy it, sure, but selling it leaves you in a position where if you withhold, Stephen Yu, who is has a good chance of going first in priority, will have a very easy time of stealing that presidency. So I think that this was definitely a mistake. Benthic could have just bought the share and had it pay out into his treasury. I don't think selling here makes any sense. He's not going to lose the presidency in this stock round since everybody else has already sold, but it's safe from that sense. But it really is a bad play, unfortunately. Blue Blood still has cash he can invest, and will be buying a CNO. Again, best paying share in the game right now. Makes sense to buy it. This does mean that Stephen Yu is going either first or second in priority. Benthic has sold out of every company besides the B&O. Could buy that market share, but I think just passes here. He does. So this means that Stephen Yu will have priority, and these players with these orange shares need to be very careful not to put them in brown. Really, the only one that's vulnerable is the NYNH, but something to be aware of. So let's just sum up here what has occurred. We've had a basically carousel or musical chairs of presidencies where 3 players have all swapped their presidencies. And this was all done to avoid a situation where Blue Blood would have a super easy way to buy in his privates. It was partially successful. Blue Blood is not operating last, but PRR is still motivated to buy in his private. Because if he does not, you could run into a situation where everybody's bought in their privates but him, and that's really kind of a terrible way to start your game. The NYNH is an okay company. It's not a great company. So Benthic has swapped for the CNO, which is really a quite good company, especially with the DNH. He's probably unhappy about that, but he's happy that he's operating last, so is almost guaranteed to be able to buy in his privates very easily. And Blue Blood started with the PRR, has probably upgraded a little bit with the CNO, but does need to worry a little bit about collusion between the B&O and the PRR, which could prevent him from ever getting into Lancaster. Finally, Lee Gamer, who was through no fault of his own, really, a non-entity in that stock round, is running the B&O and is just kind of cackling to himself in the background as his opponents have trashed all their shares. All these shares that were put into orange and yellow will be much cheaper for him to purchase in the next stock round. Anyway, Lee Gamer will make his first move and lays south. So again, if you're the CNO player, you love to see this because it puts him behind in tempo and makes it more likely that you will get a token in Lancaster. But not only does he lay south, he actually buys two trains, which is hilarious because all these players have been so afraid of buying these two trains and not being able to buy in their privates for full phase. And then the B&O player just makes all that calculus, kind of irrelevant. So everything that just occurred in the stock round matters a lot less because he bought two trains. Um, so just a really funny, ironic thing to have happened. PRR now, probably laying Pittsburgh and running for 40 instead of 30 as a result. He has priority, could withhold in order to just buy a cheaper share, but probably wants the cash for the stock round. And he's put in a rough situation by all this because, as we mentioned, he now has to buy a two train and a three train to get access to his private. It's a lot less painful. It's a much easier pill to swallow as a result of the B&O buying a two train for him. And he does open up the green trains and buys in his private. So after all that shenanigans, Blue Blood is in a situation where he will not have to buy any two trains to buy in his privates, which is very strong for him. He lays Akron and takes the number 2 tile so that there's not that opportunity for a loop from North New York to South New York, and runs for 70 and will just buy in his privates. So he's going to have a ton of cash. Will certainly be floating a company in the next stock round, but unfortunately, as a result of all the shenanigans, will be going last in priority. So not going to have a choice of his company. NYNH only has 1-2 train, probably not motivated to lay the Providence tile. May see him upgrade New York, and he does, just increase his run. So running for 70 just like the CNO. And he will also buy a 3 and buy in his private. So looking at the stock round, Blue Blood, as expected, has a ton of cash because he was able to buy in his privates, and the other players, with the exception of Lee, have fairly similar amounts of cash. Steven, however, has priority, and he also has a dumpable PRR. That's something that we neglected to mention in the last stock round, is that Blue Blood has left himself in a position where he's going to be the presidency of the PRR with much less cash than it was when he last owned it. And Steven obliges, dumps that back down into the orange, and will be floating a company. Looking at the map, the B&M is attractive because of the track laid by the NYNH. The NYC still is a viable company, though, especially for the president of the NYNH. So the NYNH president basically will determine, whether or not the NYC will have a run in operating round 3.2. So alternatively, you could be looking at the Erie, probably not looking at the CPR, as I don't believe he controls the Champlain and St. Lawrence. He does not. That's Lee Gamer. So his decision is between the Erie and the B&M, also the NYC, but the NYC is a little bit risky. And he will choose, he also sells down the NYNH, so that's interesting. It gives him a little bit of a higher par, but it doesn't allow him to par for 100, so I'm surprised to see that. He also has put that company in orange, so Benthic can buy a bunch of these cheap shares if he wants. He starts the B&M. That's probably the right choice. It has the most synergy with the way the map is developed. Lee Gamer just going to be snapping up some cheap shares, and we'll buy a CNO. Benthic now doesn't have enough money to float without selling, may be motivated to sell out of the CNO, as this is a company that is dumpable and has very little cash with no permanent trains. So he does just that. And what does he look to par? So he's the NYNH president, does have the opportunity to par the NYC and play nice with it. And that's what he does. And Blue Blood doesn't have to sell anything because he has a ton of cash. We'll just be taking the Erie. I think that the Erie, unfortunately, when the NYC and the NYNH are working together, is kind of a dead letter. He does have the PRR and CNO, so he can ensure that Pittsburgh stays open for the Erie, but he's in a rough position now because he has two companies with no cash and no permanent trains. Which is very dangerous. The other thing I'll point out is that both of these companies are in orange, so if he doesn't pay out at least once, they will be stealable. And he's probably going last in priority because he was the last to par his company. So needs to be very aware of the presidencies of his two companies. Stephen Yu buying the B&M, Lee Gamer passing, probably just going to be seeing these companies float. Looks like Blue Blood is going to do a little stock trashing. Unfortunately, he bought that. Oh, it was a market share. So he didn't lose any cash of his own by doing that. It does hurt League Gamer, but really not that much. B&M still continuing to float. Blue Blood is floating his Erie, and the other players are also floating their companies. So Blue Blood is one share away from floating and will be going last in the next stock round. Stephen, you had enough leftover cash in order to buy a cheap orange share. This should be, well, it could be paying out. As we mentioned, it has to pay out at least once, or else it'll be in brown and leave the opportunity for that other shares to be snapped up by a single player. Benthic sells an NYC, so just looking to buy a paying share as the NYC is not going to be operating for one turn. I don't think that operating order matters all that much in this scenario. We're a good distance away from the fives, and there's not too much competition for track. Probably the most important track competition is around Lancaster right now, and that's the C&O and the B&O. The B&O needs 2 track lays to get there, and so does the C&O as long as the PRR doesn't upgrade. But I think the prospects for the B&O getting into Lancaster are very low because the C&O and PRR player are the same person. So they should be able to collude to prevent that. The other thing to note is that whoever lays this Providence tile is going to be doing the other company a big favor. So you probably want to operate later in turn order as a result of that. And currently the NYNH is well behind the B&M. There's no chance to manipulate that. So just selling a share, not really manipulating turn order. And he buys an NYNH. Again, he needed to be careful because if this ends up in brown, if he were to fall back, which there's no chance of his trains rusting before they run, so he's only going to fall back if he withholds. If he had left that share in the market, that company was stealable. So just protecting his presidency. Also, the NYNH should run pretty well, so reasonable to buy that share. Blue Blood has one more share to buy before he floats, and does. So I imagine everyone is going to be passing here. Benthic could buy one of these cheap orange shares, but maybe valuing priority. Although the difference between going second to last and last is pretty insignificant, so probably should pick up a cheap paying share here, but we'll just pass. So priority into the next stock round is going to be with Steven. And there are a ton of shares that are very cheap for him to take advantage of. Unfortunately for him, he doesn't have a private to buy in. He has no private income, and the B&M is going to run just one time, so he's not going to have a ton of cash. B&M upgrading Boston, probably hoping that the NYNH player will do him a favor and lay Providence, but I don't think he's going to get lucky there. That would be a pretty bad play. He buys 2-3 trains, so he's also just telegraphed that he's going to be looking to run through Providence. So the NYNH player would really be foolish to lay that track for him. Erie's first operation, he is heading up towards Rochester, it looks like. He buys a 2-train out of the C&O, but he actually doesn't shuffle very much money into that company. Did have the opportunity of leaving quite a bit more money in the company, putting it in a better position. He could suitcase the Erie pretty well, at least for a couple of operating rounds, and just leave the company without any cash at all and hope to push trains, which would put some pressure on the other players. But it looks like he's going to be, leaving money for a 3 and a 4, a 3 and a 5, a 4 and a 5 in that company. But that's neglecting the token cost as well. So I don't really know. Maybe not the best play. He does buy the 4 and rust everybody 2s, so none of the 2s will run. It's really bad news for the B&O player as he did not have a 3 train. B&O, again, he's in a rough spot because 1, he's falling back, but 2, he is really not have good prospects of getting into Lancaster. So he can upgrade Baltimore here, which will give him an option of running into this tile here and hoping heading west. But he also may just rush towards Philadelphia. Unfortunately for him, he again doesn't control when the Philadelphia track gets upgraded, so he's really in a rough spot here. He will be forced to buy a 4 train. and he also buys in as private, but he does importantly not lay the DIP there. NYC's first operation going to be cooperating with the NYNH as they're owned by the same president. He buys a second, or just a first 4-train. PRR, so he can upgrade Philadelphia. He can also upgrade Lancaster. Neither of these tiles are really under attack since he's also operating the C&O. I guess it would make sense for him to upgrade Philadelphia here and prevent the B&O from getting a run in there. And instead he's going to help the C&O. Really not crucial that he does that. I guess I've been a little bit short-sighted though. He's also under attack at Reading and Allentown from the NYNH and the NYC player. So maybe hoping just to get the C&O into Lancaster a little bit faster and saying that Philadelphia is going to be relegated to the B&O. Not the end of the world, especially since he does have the potential to upgrade Philadelphia and Brown and control where it ultimately goes. So probably the right move there, actually. He runs for 50 and he withholds. So this is, potentially very dangerous for him. He is in Brown and does not have priority. This company could be stolen from him. It's not irredeemable just yet. He can pay out in the next operating round and prevent this, but needs to be very aware of that. NYNH going to be linking up with NYC and running his 3-train for 90. Probably this player is hoping to get into Reading and Allentown by upgrading this tile here, but it's going to take him at least 2 operating turns to do that, and the C&O and PRR should be able to beat him. C&O's operation, he upgrades Lancaster. That does ensure that Reading and Allentown will be his to dictate. And he's going to run for, he's just tokening. He runs for 80. And he also withholds. So again, this presidency is not vulnerable, but he's, allowing other players to potentially buy a ton of shares on him if he doesn't pay out in the next operating round. B&M's first operation has 2 3-trains, so it does lay the Providence, and we'll have to token there if he wants to take advantage of his trains, which he does. He runs pretty well, 170, but that's all the cash he's going to have for the next stock round. Blue Blood, if he wants to run, will have to lay up to Rochester. And does. Very underwhelming run with just 60. B&O's first time running a train this operating round as a result of falling back. Should be looking towards Philadelphia and lays that, which is very unfortunate for the PRR and C&O. They can't hit that revenue center until Brown, but they will be able to get into New York. He also lays a token on Philadelphia. I think that is a pretty risky token. There's no guarantee that it gets you anywhere valuable, and I would like you to hold on to that until Brown. You only have 3 tokens in the B&O. You need to husband them and be wise where you place them. And he will pay out. First run from the NYC. He is recognizing that he has no chance in Reading and Allentown, so we'll be just upgrading his home tile in order to increase his runs. Could be competing for that token in Rochester as well. The Erie player didn't secure it, and with some manipulation of turn order in the next set of operating rounds, could potentially run both the NYNH and the NYC to get over there. NYNH, happy that it has a ton of track laid for it now. And we'll be tokening in Albany. Probably a little bit worried that the Erie player could finagle a way to drop a token there, which would really be painful. And he pays out. So PRR now should be laying Reading and Allentown and running his 3-train into New York. And he does. So this player, as we noted, is in a very difficult position, right? Because he has very little company cash and is on the hook for 3 permanent trains, which are going to be coming very soon. So he wants to withhold because he only owns 30% of this company. But if he does, he's going to be losing control of the company almost certainly because the shares are going to be $20. Stephen Yu has $140 and would be happy to, jump from 9 shares to 14 with one action. So I think it is possible to withhold here. You just have to then shuffle all the money out of the PRR. The problem with that is then you're taking a train out of the C&O. It only has 1 train. It's going to fall back, also be in Brown. And you won't have any money to withhold with there. So I think you're pretty much obligated to pay out here. You only have 30% of the company, but the other 50% is in the market. So you're, getting 80% of the revenue, and you're securing the presidency. More importantly, unfortunately, Blue Blood does not pay out and withholds, which guarantees, I think, that this company is going to be stolen because it now has 250 bucks, much healthier, and Stephen Yu is a good player who's going to recognize the value of picking up 5 shares in one fell swoop. So that is really bad play. Blue Blood now operating the CNO and upgrades Pittsburgh. Probably not running that track, but just preparing for later. Maybe the Erie wants to get down there, and he will also withhold here. So again, 70% of that money would have gone into his treasury, the company's treasury, regardless if he had paid out. I think it's a huge mistake to withhold. And as expected, Stephen Yu will just take over the PRR. So he went from 9 shares to 14, putting him, tied for the most shares. And he had basically no cash in this in this stock round as a result of only running the B&M. So you go from a very tenuous position in this game to probably a game-winning position, or at least a contender. League Gamer has a fair amount of cash, and he could snap up some of these brown shares. Instead, we'll buy a paying share in the NYC. Benthic, he sees the brown shares and snaps those up. So again, Blue Blood has withheld and given away, 7 shares as a result. He is passing, doesn't have money for any of the cheap shares that he's created. Stephen Yu is selling the NYNH down. Benthic's probably fine with that. It does put him in the yellow, cheaper shares, but it also gives him a market share. The one thing I'll say about this is that now we have to be very cognizant of where the 5 trains are. There's poison 4 in the way, but operating order here becomes very important. Nobody is really in a position to float the CPR, but the CPR is still a valid suitcase. So as soon as that comes out, the train rush is going to take off like a rocket. He buys a paying share of the B&O. League Gamer is going to snap up that market share. Benthic, he buys an Erie. So the Erie is running pretty poorly. Probably would have been better to buy a B&M there. However, I will say that by buying the Erie, he can buy a second share, whereas if he had bought the more expensive B&M share, he'd be a little more limited in what he can buy. Blue Blood passing has no money. Steven passing, B Gamer passing, and Benthic has money for a share. He does buy it. So he has 2 shares in the Erie. This is a dumpable company. This is pretty dangerous. Is he just looking to trash the value? Yes, he is. The reason being that the NYC is competing for this Rochester token. So the Erie needs to operate after the NYC, which by selling it twice, it will happen. So that's why he's doing this. And now he has cash to buy cheap shares again. He does lose priority for this. Blue Blood will have priority into the next stock round, but he already has 2 companies and they have good synergy, so he's maybe not too worried about that. And Benthic will buy a paying share in the B&M, so that's the share that we were talking about, has the highest revenue. One thing I'll say that is that if Benthic gives Blue Blood priority, he needs to be a little bit cautious with what's going on with the CNO. That is a dumpable company. Of course, it will be in brown or orange, but if he were to take all the cash out of it and leave it train locked with 2 3s, that could be a recipe for bankruptcy. So it needs to be a little bit cautious there. And he recognizes that and will be buying a NYC from the market, maybe hoping that by putting a brown share on the market, he can entice someone to buy it and regain his position in priority. No guarantee that happens. Blue Blood could snap it up and it wouldn't help him that much. Instead, Blue Blood is going to pass and nobody takes the bait. So not a bad try, and I think Benthic was probably a little bit insecure holding those 2 shares anyways. So just late in the stock round gambit. B&M probably upgrading Providence here. Actually passing. I see there was no upgrade available to it. So that's a little bit unfortunate. Would have been an extra 20 bucks for him. B&O, needs to be a little bit careful. Doesn't have permanent train money. Upgrades Baltimore just to improve its run and pays it out. NYC is going to get to Rochester and grab that token. So real bad news for Blue Blood because he is locked out of any meaningful run until at least Brown and potentially for the whole game now. Erie does have money for a 5, but as we said, doesn't have any meaningful track. NYNH, he has 90% of this company as a result of the other players, trashing it a little bit. So he's going to be very happy to run this and just pay out. Has a little bit of a better run potentially than hitting that DIT now. Can it reach up into Rochester? And does pay it out. So at the end of this, he's going to be quite close to 5 train money in both of his companies. Well, we'll be a little bit off, but pretty close. One withhold will get him there if that needs be. PRR, it's the company that was stolen by Steven. He's happy to run his new company. Probably will continue to withhold. He's still on the hook for a permanent train, but now he can just stay brown and wait until the other players push trains. He gets a run into Baltimore, but is not actually taking advantage of that, just preventing Baltimore from running to the west for the time being. He withholds, so very close to permanent train money now. C&O, going to be looking to link up with the Erie probably, but it's going to take him a while to get there. And he pays out. So this is funny, right? Because he withheld twice in the last operating round, lost his presidency, lost a bunch of shares as a result, and now he decides it's time to pay out. Just really not great decision making. B&M still paying out, and B&O doesn't really have any track delay. Could upgrade Washington and improve its run a little bit. That's what he does. Benthic has secured the Rochester token, could be heading towards Hamilton and Toronto, probably not looking to actually lay that tile, just setting up for the future, and does. He pays out. Erie, probably looking to link up with Pittsburgh. No guarantee that that works. There are other players in the game that can prevent it. NYNH, he's going to lay towards the CPR, just leaving the option open to break a suitcase. One thing I'll point out is that Lee Gamer is sitting on the Champagne to St. Lawrence, does not have priority, and has not laid that tile. So this is a operating round where we have a very high likelihood of someone floating that CPR, and he is given the opportunity to suitcase. C&O, he is able to link up the Erie, so Erie will probably be dropping a token in Pittsburgh. C&O can secure the other token down the road. PRR, probably another withhold here. He is potentially looking to bypass Rochester, it looks like. And he does withhold. So very close to permanent train money in both of his companies in a very commanding spot. He can sell C&O and B&O, and he would not have enough money to float the CPR. Blue Blood also not in a position to float the CPR. He's buying a share in the B&M. It is a good paying company, and he gets a little bit of arbitrage from the IPO to the market. Stephen Yu. He is selling a B&M. I see. So by selling his own share in the B&M, he will have enough money to float the CPR. So pars the CPR at 82. Very motivated to have this company operate before the B&O. If he is able to buy into the 5s before the B&O operates, he will guarantee the suitcase. So Lee Gamer needs to be aware of that and hopefully do something to prevent this. Lee Gamer buying an Erie, not a great share. Benthic buying B&O, just a cheap share on the market. And Blue Blood continuing to invest in the IPO shares of the B&M. He has now trashed it, so it does hurt the stock value and the net worth of Steven a little bit, but he has already accomplished what he wanted to in the stock round by getting the CPR. He's going to continue to float. Lee Gamer buying the cheaper shares in the B&M that they've been trashed. Benthic buying an Erie. Blue Blood buying a CPO from the CNO from the market. Um, so this is a company that's probably going to be forced to withhold to buy his permanents. So not entirely sure why he's buying his own market shares. Doesn't seem very foresighted. Stephen Yu continuing to float the CPR. The gamer gonna probably trash the CPR, hopefully recognizing the danger here. Actually, as a result of the B&O being one column ahead, it's not really likely that the CPR is going to operate first, so should still have the opportunity to lay that um, tile for it. Benthic buying the other market share of the CNO. So again, this company is probably going to be withholding, but it's nice to have the brown shares early in the game. In terms of share density, Benthic is leading. Stephen Yu is close behind, but is investing quite heavily in the CPR, which is not going to be paying for at least one operating round, potentially ever if it's suitcased. Blue Blood buying in a IPO from the NYC and selling it. So trashing its value, but really not changing turn order very much. So I guess that's not true entirely. If it operates after the Erie, it may miss out on a 5 train because the CPR is going to be buying the 4 and a 5. Then the B&M has 5 train money. Actually does not, but could shuffle some money into that company with the CPR. So should be able to buy 2 trains for Stephen Yu. And then the Erie has 5 train money too. So that is important actually that Blue Blood has changed that order. Probably we'll see Benthic respond. And once these companies are ledged, there's no further change. So Benthic should be able to secure that 5 train if he wants it. We'll have to withhold for it. CPR now floated. Benthic has been paying attention, does secure himself a 5 train, and buying his own NYC from the market, NYNH from the market. Similar situation to the CNO. This company is likely to be withholding, so interesting to buy your own market share. Blue Blood buying a CNO, so that company will be floating up. I think again, well, not again, but for the first time in this video, leaving one share of yours unsold when you have a brown or orange company is important because you're basically floating your company up and your whole goal here is to remain in the brown phase. So he paid a $27 premium to buy off the IPO and is going to be forced to withhold extra times every time because this company is floating up now. So not a play that I like to see. Stephen buying a paying share in the NYC. The Gamer, limited options, passing. Benthic is buying a PRR. So on the other hand, the corollary to that is that if your opponent is running a brown company, making sure that it's floating up is probably in your benefit. One, it's a brown share that will counter your stock density, but two, it makes them withhold more, makes it harder for them to stay in the brown. So I like that he has bought this share. I do not like that Blue Blood bought that one. Blue Blood buying a share of the NYNH. And are the other players just going to pass to try and get higher in priority? Benthic is going second to last in priority currently, so probably not super motivated to sit on cash and will buy a B&M. This company is not dumpable currently. This will give Blue Blood priority into the next operating stock round. And the CNO is also not dumpable. So Benthic's probably happy to sit where he is. It looks like the other players are as well. First operation of the B&M, just running his 2-3 trains again. For some reason, I was under the impression that he was operating after the CPR. Did he float up? I must have miscalculated. So unfortunately, it looks like Stephen will not be able to buy all the 5 trains as I previously predicted by shuffling. He's going to have to wait an operating round to ensure that. B&O has no track delay. Does he withhold in preparation for a 5? He just pays out. And importantly, he did not lay the private for the CPR or the Burlington tile. So Stephen Yu now can suitcase this company very easily. He is not necessarily going to be able to guarantee that he gets all the fives like we mentioned, but he's still in a good position. The PRR has a ton of cash, um, so probably still can end up with a 5 and a 6, and he only has two companies that are going to need permanent trains in the near future. So I think this is a huge mistake from League Gamer. Not giving the CPR a run really opens up possibilities for Stephen Yu, who is already, I think, in a commanding position in this game. He is one share behind um, Benthic, but he has a ton more room on his cert limit, and he has the PRR, which is a viable company, and he has the B&M, which is going to be running, just fine with a 5 train. So he leaves his options open. He can break the suitcase himself if he wants to, and I imagine we'll see him buying a 3 and then shuffling money into the PRR. We'll see. Buying a 4. So he gives the B&M permanent train money and will allow probably the PRR to buy the last 4 and open up the 5s for his B&M and CPR. Benthic needs to be a little bit cautious here, may have to withhold to prepare for the train rush. He is going to look to link up with Pittsburgh. If he can get a token down in Pittsburgh, that's really going to kill the Erie. Also, terrible news for the CNO and for the BNO. BNO can't do anything about it. CNO could respond, does have money for a token. Erie also can respond here. But what I'll say is the Erie and the CNO are owned by the same person, so they were probably really hoping that Pittsburgh would stay open. That way, both companies can run through it. But looks like NYC is going to force the issue. He pays out, so not too worried about the permanent trains just yet. Erie, limited track options, but would like to see it token Pittsburgh here. Otherwise, the Erie's game is probably over. And he does drop that. That hurts the CNO a little bit, but the CNO still has options. Can run into New York and Philadelphia, Baltimore. So with a 5 train, still a valuable company. He pays that out, just short of permanent train money, but with a withhold could easily get there. NYNH now, does he link up with Pittsburgh? He instead is just going to throw away some track. Not entirely sure where he's going with that. Yeah. And he pays that out as well. Being a CNO now, limited track. He's going to start working on getting to the west in Chicago. This helps the Erie, but it also helps the PRR. So limited benefit there. And he withholds. So he now has permanent train money, but unlikely to be able to get a 5 because there's going to be a lot of companies operating before him in the next operating round. Imagine we'll see the PRR open up the 5s here. Stephen Yu can then buy the first 5 with the B&M and pick up the second with the CPR. He's going to continue working towards Chicago, and he withholds. And does he buy the 4? He actually did not. So looking at operating order here, he has the B&M, which can buy the 4 and with a withhold buy the 5. Then the CPR can buy a 5, and the B&O will also buy a 5. And then this PRR company is pretty close to a 6 train. So he has orchestrated this very well. He's in a great position as this train rush kicks off. Running just 1 train now, and he actually doesn't even need to withhold because he has the market shares. So he does initiate the permanent trains, discards a 3, and then the B&O is going to have access to Brown, probably upgrades Philadelphia, but we'll have to withhold to pick up that second 5. Gets himself a run into New York. And does withhold for the 5. CPR has a 5, well, will have 5 train money, has ensured that it can be suitcased. He could also run it. He has invested in these shares. He's running a Brown company, so he's looking for paying shares, and he's really in no danger in the stock rush, so he doesn't need to suitcase this company anymore. So even though Lee Gamer really missed an opportunity, it looks like probably Steven's going to just decide to run this company, and he's guaranteed it by laying that track. Picks up the last 5. So again, The reason why he does that instead of suitcasing is because he has all these brown PRR shares. So he's looking to go late and just run on share density. And he's basically got permanent train money in the PRR already. So he's not worried. So really well played to him. This puts Benthic and Blue Blood in a very rough situation because they're basically staring down the nose of the sixes. Neither of them have any permanent trains. They're both on hook for two of them, and neither one of them have all that much money. So unless one of them can pick up both sixes, they're going to be out of pocket for a D, and that's going to hurt quite badly. Blue Blood, probably not at risk of bankruptcy, but is pretty close. Um, Benthic a little bit healthier, but not looking great for either of these players. So Benthic is in a situation where he may want to force buy a six by withholding on the NYC and then shuffling the NY and H over, and that will prevent the PRR from having an easy withhold for the six at least. It will also allow the the CNO to buy the six instead of the PRR. So that's probably, I think I remember that's what he does, which is probably the right move. Upgrades New York, has a little bit of a better run, withholds, and he does shuffle the train out of the N1H. So it gives it just enough money for the 6 and leaves enough money in the NYC to help it for its eventual D train. Erie has access to Brown, going to be hoping to get over to Hamilton and Toronto, but needs to be very careful that it has money for its permanent trains, so that $80 track is probably not super appealing right now. He pays it out. NY&H, trainless, probably upgrading Albany. Instead, upgrading, that's interesting. So just looking to prevent the CNO and PRR from running into New York with a gentle curve upgrade here. Could the NYC have tokened in Philadelphia? It could have. So that would have been an alternative move to secure New York North and allow the NY and H to have a little bit of a better run. But the NY and H is going to be running a 6 train, so it doesn't need too many stops. So just, half of one, 6 of another. And he does buy the 6 here. So looks like the CNO will be getting the second 6, and the PRR will either have to out of pocket a D or more likely will shuffle this 4 over and then just withhold until it can afford its permanent trains. So I think that was the right play from the NYC player, but unfortunately Stephen Yu is just in a very commanding position as a result of the way the game has broken. CNO does have access to brown tiles, upgrades Lancaster, and he has no train to run, so will out of pocket the 6. This puts him in a position where he has very little cash going to the stock round. He is way behind in net worth, and this player is functionally eliminated from the game. Could be looking at a bankruptcy if he's not careful. PRR also trainless, but fortunately the CPR has a train for him to buy, upgrades Pittsburgh, and it was actually the BNM. So entering this stock round, Stephen Yu is technically behind in net worth, but he has probably the strongest position in the game. Benthic has secured himself one permanent train, is $700 short of a D train, and there are no permanent trains available other than the D train, so he's going to be forced to buy that eventually. Blue Blood has one permanent train and is a little bit ahead of Benthic in terms of cash towards the D. Probably has a worse run, so may fall behind if there's a rush for the upgrade. And then Lee Gamer, the final player in the game, has a 4 to 5. He's going to be able to run them quite well until that D train comes out, but I think his long-term potential in this game is limited as a result of being tokened out of Pittsburgh and Lancaster. So I think all these players are just looking to buy safe paying shares now. There are dump opportunities. If any of these players are able to engineer a dump, that could really change the game state because it would bring the D train out faster potentially. But I think that in general, Stephen Yu is just going to be withholding 3 times and then probably going for the upgrade. And I think he wins the game if that's the way the game plays out. Blue Blood buying a CPR. CPR is not going to be a well-paying company, a very low yield share. Stephen Yu buying the Erie, another pretty low value share, just because you expect that company is going to be withholding for the D. Lee Gamer buying a B&M. This company will run pretty well. This does open him up to a dump if he's not careful. Benthic buying an Erie. Blue Blood out of cash because he had out of pocket $100-something for that 6 train in the C&O. Stephen Yu probably buying his last share here, buying a B&O. Lee Gamer actually selling the B&M doesn't hurt its value at all and makes it safe for Benthic to hold. So basically just a wasted stock action by buying that B&M share last time. And he's just going to pass, not buy anything. This is a player that has not invested in any other company above 20%, so very risk averse. Benthic buying a B&O. This does open him up to a dump, but Lee Gamer only has one company and has a permanent train in it, so that will not be happening. Unfortunately, Benthic is very near his cert limit, and this is the danger of giving someone a brown company like this. Steven sells an Erie and buys the last B&O, probably recognizing that the Erie is likely to be withholding and the B&O is going to be burning very hot until the D train comes out. This does leave Lee Gamer with priority, but again, no real dump opportunity. So I think we're nearing the end of this game. We will just kind of rush through here. He upgrades Providence. Finally, as a result of Lancaster and Pittsburgh being upgraded, he's able to optimize his run, has a 5 train, and is really only able to hit 5 stops. So the B&M is pretty happy. I take that back. He could avoid one of those dits and hit Albany instead. So maybe losing a little bit out on efficiency there. Bino running 2 trains, upgrades Baltimore, probably hitting Baltimore twice, and has some very lucrative runs. 410. So he owns the majority of that company, but 2 other players are split. So this is not going to be the deciding factor between Benthic and Steven. But it is really helping Lee Gamer, who is really not that far behind. He's massively far behind in shares, but in terms of net worth, at least, having those massive runs with the B&O is really helpful. CPR coming down to compete at Hamilton and Toronto, going to take him a while to get there, and running for just 70 in the meantime. Erie, he is not laying any track. Really could head towards Chicago through Columbus or upgrade Hamilton, Toronto, but he's really got to be nervous about this D train, so probably not eager to spend $80 on Hamilton, Toronto. The other thing that you have to worry about is that by putting this green tile down, you open up the New York Central to laying the brown. So those 00 tiles are, a double-edged sword. Running for 150, and he does withhold. So he's going to be 2 withholds away from the D train with his current run. New York Central, he upgrades Albany, just improving his run. And he also withholds, and he is just like the Erie, 2 withholds away from the upgrade. So he's going to lose out on the upgrade to the Erie. NYNH, upgrading Baltimore and running for 240, which is decent, but not going to be, a game-winning revenue. He withholds. I see. So he's going to shuffle a train out of the NYC, which is not going to be enough to give him the upgrade. It's like $6 short or something like that, $4 short. And is he just going to emergency buy the D to prevent these other players from running their 4 trains anymore? It looks like he's going to force the issue on the D train. So aggressive play, but one that probably needs to happen because Lee Gamer is running for so much, and also Stephen Yu is under no pressure here. He can just withhold forever for the PRR and then eventually run that D train very well. Sino running for 240, and he pays that out. He also had the opportunity to withhold and do the same thing with the Erie, and the Erie operates before the New York. It wouldn't really change all that much. So if he withheld 240, he would have had enough for the upgrade. So actually that probably would have been the better play. Would have saved himself $300. And also, this is a company that he's motivated to keep in the yellow and brown anyways, so he probably wants to withhold anyways. So I think a missed opportunity from Blue Blood there. PRR going to be withholding, hoping to get a D-Train money. And he is pretty close. Can't get the upgrade, obviously, but he's not going to be sweating out of pocketing, the D-Train when he's that close to it. B&M running his 5-train and does take the opportunity to skip this DIT, so just missed it for one turn. Increases his run by $40 as a result. Lee Gamer, last time he's going to be running this 4-train, it looks like, and just laying some track to lay track. Doesn't have any real improvement out of his run. CPR, looking to actually not eager to enter the fray for Hamilton, realizes he doesn't have the cash in the company to lay that tile anyways, so we'll be taking the safe move and heading up to Canadian West. Erie, as a result of the C&O not shuffling trains, is not going to be able to get the upgrade here. And is $3 short. That's pretty devastating. NYC, as a result of shuffling trains, will be out of pocketing the D train, something that he felt necessary, but is painful to do. So PRR and the Erie will be falling back in the next operating round. NYNH does have a train and links up with Pittsburgh, so just going to be basically bypassing Rochester and getting an extra $20 to its run. And he actually withholds that. So I guess hoping to stay yellow because he recognizes that the Stephen Yu player is going to be able to far exceed him in terms of share density otherwise. That is painful, though. He owns 60% of that company, so it's really hurting his revenue. He is trailing quite far behind Stephen Yu. Stephen is going to have to pay about $300 or so, so that's going to bring him closer, but that really hurts doing that withhold. C&O running and paying out. Last operation of this set. PRR is on the hook for a D train and maybe looking to eventually get into New York through Scranton. So something that the NYC and NYNH player need to be aware of. PRR is run by the same player that owns the B&M, so this would potentially help both companies. And a token in New York from PRR would really hurt the New York player. He out of pockets the D. So at the end of that stock round, the net worth is favoring Lee Gamer as a result of his 2 runs of the 4-train, but that will be slowing down for him now. And Stephen Yu and Benthic are pretty much neck and neck. They have similar number of shares. They are similarly far from their cert limits. And the NYC has a pretty good run, but the PRR also has a pretty good run. So it's a close game. And we'll see how it turns out. Stephen Yu operating the B&M doesn't have cash for the $120 tile, but will be very close to having it. And in fact, can lay Scranton now. So something that the New York player needs to really pay close attention to. If the B&M upgrades Scranton, the New York player needs to upgrade it in green away from this hookup, or else he's going to be regretting losing that token in New York. B&O, just upgrading his run a little bit. Doesn't actually change anything. And he's running for 260, much worse now that that 4-train is rusted. CPR linking up with Barry is going to be running a lot better now. And pays out. Erie does have cash to upgrade Hamilton in Toronto, but is on the hook for a D train. I can't imagine he will be going bankrupt. He will not be, but it does put him even further in last place. He's having to sell shares, which is miserable for him. NYNH does get the upgrade on Hamilton, does lay it towards the Erie, probably recognizing that Blue Blood has eliminated himself from the game and just trying to make sure that he doesn't give an easy way for CPR to get into these revenue centers. running for 350. That's an okay run, but unfortunately, because of the way that Double O City was laid, is going to be limited. He's not going to be able to head west through Cleveland, through Detroit, and into Chicago. CNO running for 240 and paying out. So Blue Blood needs to get cash from somewhere, and as a result, is no longer able to keep the CNO in the yellow. That hurts him quite a bit because he's not going to be able to really exceed his cert limit very much. And it hurts Benthic a little bit because he had 2 shares that were yellow that no longer will be. So much closer to his cert limit now than he would otherwise have been. Benthic happy to pay out with the NYNH, I'm sure, because he's still going to be in yellow. And the PRR deep in the brown, going to be looking towards the double O at Dunkirk and hopefully, from his perspective, increasing his run eventually. I don't know that that really helps him that much. Probably running through Chicago is still more lucrative, and he pays that out. So Benthic has the most cash going into this stock round. Stephen Yu is close. Actually, sorry, Lee Gamer has a ton of cash. Benthic and Stephen Yu are far behind and closely following each other, and Blue Blood is in last place, both in net worth and in cash. Um, I think that while Lee Gamer is slightly ahead in net worth, the fact that his B&O is so underwhelming is going to cost him the game. So it's really going to come down to Benthic and Stephen Yu. Benthic is trailing in net worth by $8 and 1 share ahead, but unfortunately he is only 4 shares from his cert limit, whereas Stephen Yu is 5 shares from his. So they will be able to even that up. And then in terms of shares that are available, there's not that many shares that are safe for Benthic to invest in because Stephen Yu controls the PRR, so can always withhold and shuffle a train out and do a dump. So, for instance, Benthic can't really buy any more shares in the B&M, and the CPR is also a risky investment. He will be limited to probably investing in the Erie, and that's it. Can't buy any shares in the NYC or the NYNH. So shares that are available to Benthic are much more limited than shares that are available to Stephen Yu. Lee Gamer passing. So he has a ton of cash, is nowhere near his cert limit, and is basically just allowing the players that have had their shares in the yellow and brown to really take advantage of that strategy. Each share that Lee Gamer buys is 1 share that one of these other players can't buy. So I think this behavior really distorts the game and really favors players that are able to safely buy shares, namely Stephen Yu. Um, and by not buying any shares, he's guaranteeing that he's lost. Blue Blood is also eliminated, but can buy shares. So Benthic buys an Erie share. Not technically safe, as Blue Blood could dump and buy a share over into the CNO, but probably not very motivated to do that. Running a 6 and a D with the same company, especially with limited track that the CNO has, is not very appealing. Blue Blood has to sell, and he has to sell, which company is this? In the CNO. So that's unfortunate for Benthic because Blue Blood's going to sell a share that's going to put it back into the yellow, and Stephen Yu is going to be able to snap that up. And he buys a CPR. Stephen Yu actually not prioritizing that yellow share. I guess realizing that he's unlikely to reach his cert limit, so doesn't really need to worry about the yellow share for now. The Erie's run is that much better than the CNO? It's probably a little bit better, but maybe not significantly so. Lee Gamer continuing to pass. Again, we've talked about how that's problematic. Benthic does snap up that yellow share. Unfortunately, I don't think any of these players are going to be reaching their cert limits, so the value of that yellow share is a little bit limited. Blue Blood buying a CPR. What I will say about the CNO shares is that they're safe for Benthic to own. So we were talking about how he's going to have trouble buying safe shares. At least, that share is one that's safe for him. Blue Blood buys a CPR, and Stephen Yu buys an NYC. Benthic's not able to invest in that, so he's happy to see Stephen Yu buying NYC shares rather than these other companies where Benthic can still invest. Lee Gamer passing. Benthic buys a CPR. It will be safe for him to hold that, but he needs to be careful not to buy another one. and Blue Blood buying a B&M, Stephen Yu buying an NYC. So again, Benthic probably pretty happy to see that. And Lee Gamer passing, Benthic buying the B&M. So this is problematic because this is a very dumpable company. So in a close game, Stephen Yu is going to have basically a gun to Benthic's head and can always, if he starts to realize he's falling behind, can just dump this company and win the game as a result. So I think, the way that the shares have broken here basically guarantee that Stephen Yu is going to win this game. Blue Blood buying the CPR, and that is also a dumpable company. So it's really going to come down to priority here. If Benthic leaves this stock round with not priority on Steven, he's probably going to lose the game. And that's totally out of his control because he has Blue Blood operating after him. Stephen Yu free to buy the NYNH shares, and the game is just called. So I think these players probably realized that it was a close game between Benthic and Stephen Yu, but two players have been eliminated and it just wasn't worth continuing. So I wanted to commentate this game just because of the interesting shenanigans in the early stock round and just to talk through the consequences of operating turn order and buying in your privates. The rest of the game was a little bit less interesting, but I think that one stock round in particular was very, very illustrative and very educational. So I hope you appreciate the video, and we will be back with more in the future.